Hey everyone, Chris here with a brand new update to the Beaver Builder Flexbox plugin. Version 1.3 is now available. It's a pretty big update, so I wanted to make this video that talks about all the changes. The Beaver Builder 2.6 update brought us a new large device responsive breakpoint. That new breakpoint now works with Beaver Builder Flexbox 1.3, giving you even more ways to customize Flexbox across all your different size devices. So there's for the large, so you do 3 columns, medium 2, mobile 1, and it all just works now. Prior to the 1.3 update, the CSS code that gets generated by the plugin looked a little sloppy and was often a bit redundant. So we had all this code that was being generated for just activating Flexbox. All that's been cleaned up. If you were to inspect the generated style sheet, you'll now only see the CSS that needs to be there. This code looks much cleaner, and the smaller output just might help your page load a fraction of a percentage faster. At least I like to think that it does. When I first created this plugin, in the interest of keeping things simple, I only gave us the option for selecting the number of columns that we wanted our flex items to appear in. I took 100%, which is the full width of the column, and divided that by the number of columns that we selected. So let's say this one's set to 4 columns, so then if you were to inspect and take a look at the flex basis, you'll see that's 100 divided by 4 gives you a flex basis of 25%. Now this worked out fine for the most part, but some of you requested more options for the flex basis. So with the 1.3 update, we now have the option to change the flex basis setting from number of columns, which is still the default, over to custom. This lets you directly set the flex basis to whatever you want, including pixel values. So right now this is set to auto. If we want to do a custom basis of, let's say, 300 pixels, just type that in there, and then each of our modules will be 300 pixels wide. This can be useful in your module settings if you wanted to override the flex basis set by your column and apply a specific flex basis pixel to just one module. So let's say on this module, on the advanced settings, I'm going to override the column settings, and then instead of number of columns, which is 4 or set to 25%, I'll go to custom, and let's say if I want to make this 200 pixels wide, and this one module will shrink down to 200 pixels. Everything else will stay at the 25%. Speaking of module override settings, before version 1.3, if you were to take a look at the advanced tab of the module, let's see, like this one right here, you would see a Flexbox option to override the column settings, also with a note saying that you still need to activate Flexbox in the column settings. Well, now there's no more need for that because your module can now detect when Flexbox is active in the column. So going over to 1.3, let's say if I were to disable Flexbox in the column settings, we'll just turn Flexbox off for now. Go back to the module settings, and under the advanced tab, you see that the Flexbox option is no longer there. Re-enable Flexbox. Then go to the module settings, and there it is, giving the option to override it. When I released Beaver Builder Flexbox version 1.2, I added the options for adding a column gap and a row gap between all the flex items. This feature was somewhat useful. Like here's a row gap that can make your rows gap between your row bigger, but with the column gap it was sort of a problem. That's because flex basis doesn't take the column gap into consideration. So for example, if you had set your number of flex columns to 5, this would give you a flex basis of 20% and would put your modules into 5 columns. However, if you wanted to add a column gap in between everything, this would force the modules in your 5th column to flex to the next row. So then you would have to subtract a certain number of pixels from your flex basis in order to make everything appear in 5 columns. A quick side note for those who are interested. If you'd like to know how to calculate the exact number of pixels to subtract from your flex basis to make this work, you take the size of your column gap, divide it by the number of columns, and then multiply by the number of column gaps. Subtract that number of pixels from your flex basis and you're good to go. So for example, I've got a column gap of 20 pixels. I'm going to divide that by my 5 columns. 20 divided by 5 is 4, and then multiply that by the number of column gaps, which is also 4. So 4 times 4 is 16, so that means I only need to subtract 16 pixels in order to make this work. You can see if I went one less than that and only subtracted 15, that's going to force the 5th column to the next row, so 16 is my magic number. However, with version 1.3, that calculation is done automatically, so you don't have to worry about it. So let's say I'm going to make this 5 columns, and then make the column gap 20. There we go. It's still on 5 columns, and everything is done automatically. If you were to inspect it, you can see that there's a calculation done there. I got 20% minus 16 pixels. And every time if you were to change the number of columns, everything's going to still stay updated, and everything's just going to work magically, even if you increase the column gap. However, there are 2 things to point out. First, the automatic calculation only works when the basis setting is set to number of columns. If you set it to custom and you have 25%, and then you wanted to add a column gap, I'm going to bring 20 back on here for 20 pixels, it's going to still push the 4th column to the next row. So you have to manually calculate, and you can do a calc 25% minus 16 pixels, and that'll make it work. Second, if you were to override the flex basis setting for one individual module, you'll still need to manually calculate the number of pixels to subtract using that formula I mentioned above. So right now, this is still set to 20% in the column settings, but since it doesn't automatically subtract the number of pixels it needs, you're going to need to enter that here. So that would have been 16 pixels on there if you wanted to override that. There you go. Now let's make all that line back up again. Prior to version 1.3, when you activated Flexbox in a column, it would only treat the modules in that column as flex items. For example, I've got a column here, and I want to drag the entire column into my flex column, making this a child column. Now you may have noticed that child columns don't really behave the same way that the rest of the modules do. If I were to change the settings in the column, let me change it from, let's say, 4 columns to 3 columns, you'll see that the child column is kind of just sitting there, not really behaving the same way that the rest of the modules are. It's kind of just doing its own thing. That's because the flex basis doesn't get applied to it. I'm happy to say that's been taken care of in version 1.3. Now, if that flex column has any child columns in it, let me move this back here in version 1.3. They will all be treated as flex children. So you can see this column is lined up in the same way the rest of these are. If I were to go to my column settings, change the number of columns, let's say go to 3, you can see it all just fits. When we have a child column that is acting as a flex child for the parent column that it's in, if you go to that child column settings, you'll see some new options. The top options are still there for if you want to activate Flexbox, making this child column a flex container and the modules inside it flex items. However, since this child column is also a flex item for the column that it's in, you also see the same override options that you see in your modules. So if I wanted to hit override on here, it'll activate these extra options. And let's say if I wanted to activate align self-center, you'll see it will just affect this child column that it's in. Finally, you can now activate Flexbox on Beaver Builder rows, turning the column groups into flex items. As long as each column in your row is initially set up on top of each other, they will be treated as a flex item. If the columns are initially set up side by side, they are in the same column group, meaning they will all be treated as a single flex item. Let me show you what I mean. So let's say you wanted to recreate this row containing 6 columns as flex items. I'm going to go ahead and delete this whole thing. I've got these 6 columns saved right here. I find the easiest way to get this set up initially is to leave Flexbox turned off. So I'm going to drag column number 1 onto my new row. When I drag column number 2, don't put it side by side initially because that will make it part of the same column group. Flexbox will take care of that later. Each column needs to be in its own column group in order for it to act as a flex child. So column number 2, I'm putting underneath column number 1. I'm going to do the same for column 3, 4, 5, and 6. So I've got all the columns in a row underneath one another. This puts each column into their own column group. Then when I go to the row settings, Advanced tab, activate Flexbox, yes. I want to put this in 3 columns. There we go. I want to make my row gap 20 and my column gap 20. There we go. Now I'm going to go to the row settings and make the column full width, look just like it did before. Now if you go to the column settings and Flexbox is active in your row, you'll see the same override settings that I talked about when dealing with the child columns. So you can override this one column right here and do whatever you want with it. Real quick, I'm going to go ahead and turn Flexbox back off because I want to show you what does happen when you take two columns and add them side by side so that they're in the same column group. So let me disable Flexbox. I'm going to take my second column. I'm going to move it to be right next to my first column so that it looks like this. Then if I were to go to my row settings and activate Flexbox, you'll see that since these are in the same column group, they're both treated like the same flex item. That's why they're side by side, and they don't follow the same rules as the rest of them. You can see that the combined total width is the same as the width of these other two flex items. Maybe that's the way you want it, and you're perfectly welcome to do it that way, but that's what happens.